Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special session, an interview with three authors of Resetting Our Future. This is a series of books published by Changemakers Books, and I'm Tim Ward, the publisher of the company that's put them out. These are books by pragmatic visionaries, including someone you know well, Rebecca Corbin. We are writing books that take advantage of this terrible moment in time, in the midst of a pandemic that has disrupted our lives, disrupted our livelihoods, and caused a lot of suffering. And yet, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to literally reset our future. As we turn the corner, eventually, as vaccines come out, there will be the opportunity to rebuild. And how we choose to rebuild will give us an opportunity to take a different run at solving some of the big issues that are facing us, that we know are facing us. Issues such as inequality, poverty, climate change, species loss, racial injustice, so many issues. We are going to have a fresh take on. These books are meant to get out in front of this. And today, I'm so delighted to have a chance to talk with three of the authors of this series. Rebecca Corbin, the president of the National Association for Community College Entrepreneurship, Anne Kabagambe, who until recently was an executive director with the World Bank Group Board, and Paul O'Brien, who's a vice president of Oxfam America. I'll introduce each of them, have a short conversation with them one by one, and then the four of us will discuss what it takes to truly create a different future. First, I'd like to introduce you to Anne Kabagambe. She's worked in the African Development Bank for many years in their leadership team. And for the last 4 years, she's been in Washington, D.C., working as the alternate and then the executive director for the World Bank Group, representing 22 African countries. And her book is about creating a global playbook for the next pandemic. And please tell us a bit about yourself and your book.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm very happy to be here. Let me start with my book. So as you rightly said, the question I pose in my book is, what will be the response of the global community to the next pandemic? And therefore the title, A Global Playbook for the Next Pandemic. And my premise is that as we continue to look at the current pandemic and the challenges that we are facing, we still at the same time have to ask ourselves, what will the global community do to improve on the coordination, the collaboration, the cooperation, and of course the communication to make these kinds of pandemics be better managed. So my response is based on my recent background. And therefore, let me explain, as Tim has said, that I was serving at the World Bank as a board member until recently. And I was representing African countries and also responsible for other fiduciary roles. And during this period, I was able to experience firsthand what the international community can do when they work together to respond to this type of crisis, and especially because the World Bank has the health and development nexus. I felt very strongly that the response to my question in the book would be to have one organization leading the collaboration of both the national and global efforts to respond to the next pandemic, and therefore the global playbook for the next pandemic would be well coordinated by an organization like the World Bank Group. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And so, Anne, how specifically could education systems in countries around the world be part of pandemic preparedness?
That is precisely part of my book, because there are many players in responding to a crisis like the one we are facing right now. Their governments, their citizens, their educational institutions, and of course the private sector. To your question, the only way that we get our citizens to understand what is going on is through an educational process, and therefore it starts with our educators and the system that disseminates information through the educational system.
All right. And are you seeing any countries that seem to be getting this right, that are putting a stress on education as connected to preparing for future pandemics?
Well, let's start with something as practical as educational institutions being the centers of getting the citizens together and the treatment through which most countries have responded. So, for example, if I take two of the countries that I was working with, if you look at Rwanda, for example, the educational system, even as the schools were closed, they were able to use these institutions to carry out the health education and distribution that was necessary during the major period of the crisis. But beyond that, it is through disseminating information through education, especially once we get into the vaccines distribution, that I think the educational system would be coming on board. In terms of the other examples we saw then in 2014 in Sierra Leone, that it was through the school system that information on the previous pandemic like Ebola was able to be disseminated.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Now, in your time at the World Bank, what have you seen, Anne, specifically regarding girls' education, which I know you are passionate about, and entrepreneurial mindset training, these skills that people can be given, that gives you hope for the future?
Well, thank you for asking this question, because I strongly believe that it is through providing education to the girl child that nations will be able to advance in their fight against poverty reduction and boosting prosperity. What I have seen through my recent experience is that you actually cannot distinguish and move education away from health services. The two go together. And therefore, as in this recent experience of the pandemic, we see the importance of having these two social services work hand in hand. The second aspect is that in developing countries, we have already seen that the budget of the education system and the health system have always taken a back seat to other development efforts like infrastructure and energy, roads, and everything. But we are moving, I believe, as nations, especially with this recent experience, to really put forward the idea of educating girls and also boys and providing them with health at the same level of resources as we do to other efforts that work towards development advancement for the countries.
All right, thank you, and that is so important. I'd like to now introduce you to our next author, Paul O'Brien, who's a vice president for Oxfam America, and he has worked in challenging countries all over the world. He's worked in Afghanistan, he's worked in Kenya, and he's worked out of Washington, D.C., addressing one of the biggest challenges there is when it comes to reversing extreme inequality. His book has the provocative title, Power Switch. And Paul, I'd like you to tell us some more about yourself and your book.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be here. Yeah, I have the privilege of working for Oxfam. And just to give you a little sense of Oxfam, it's a big non-governmental organization that has activists. And what makes us a little different, it has activists in places like Washington, London, Beijing, Delhi, South Africa, Brazil, trying to shape the policies of powerful nations and big international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to fight poverty and inequality. I've been the leader of our work in the United States to reshape our US efforts. So I try to convince the US government and other institutions to do more on behalf of people on the wrong side of poverty. Yeah, so that's Oxfam, and that's work that I feel really privileged to do. I wrote the book, which, as Tim says, it's called Power Switch, because I believed we were facing a real crisis, but in that crisis, there was opportunity, and there was opportunity for young activists. So I wrote the book essentially for activists who are young in their careers and are trying to decide how they might want to spend their time as they fight against different forms of inequality, particularly economic inequality, but also racial and gender inequality. So it's really targeting what do activists need to know, what might they do if they want to be effective, and particularly in the United States, what could they do to be politically powerful? So I wrote a lot about power in the book and how we need to switch it. I made a little bit of a bet in writing the book that we would have a Biden and Harris administration. So the book is premised on that. But the key question the book asks is, okay, so we have a Biden and Harris administration. Are they actually going to do anything to fight global inequality? My answer to that is only if activists decide to hold them to account. And that's what the book's about.
All right, wonderful. And what a great tool, especially for young people who want to make the world a better place, to really dig in and learn what it will actually take. Now, you mentioned a really important concept in the book, redistribution, and specifically redistribution of opportunity. Could you elaborate on what that means, please?
Yeah, well, I go even further than that. I talk a lot in the book about redistributing power, because the thing about power is that a lot of people like to talk about it as a sort of a thing that you can have capacity. You know, you can grow your power, you can empower yourself, and you can empower others, which is fine. It's a good thing. In fact, it's a really important part of activism, to grow in movements, to grow together, and to grow yourself, to grow your own power. But if you really want to change inequality, then you have to talk about not just who do we want to see growing their power, but who needs to have less power. A lot of what the book documents is that there is now so much power, you can call it opportunity, but there's so much power in the form of money and other things sitting in so few hands that it has left too many people in the world without opportunity and without power. And what we're going to need to do as activists, the book argues, is you're going to have to find ways through activism to reduce the amount of power that certain folks have and increase the power that others have, meaning redistribute it. Now, honestly, for a long time, people have been saying, ooh, redistribution, that sounds like socialism. That sounds like communism. No, it isn't. It's simply the idea that if all we ever talk about is, let's just keep growing the pie, let's just keep making it bigger and bigger and bigger, because everyone will have enough if we do, well, that only works if the person who's holding the knife to divide the pie is doing so fairly. And when you talk about redistributing power, you say, hold on a second, we're not just going to talk about how big the pie needs to be in this world, we're also going to talk about how the pie is shared. And if it's not being shared at all, if the slices that are going to people in poverty are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, then it doesn't matter how big you grow the pie or grow the economy. It matters how much people in poverty get. And for that, we're going to have to talk about redistributing.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think one thing that this pandemic has done is it's a common human experience we're having. Every nation on earth has had to deal with the pandemic, and most nations are still now really in the throes of a deep crisis caused by it. So how do you think this has amplified the global community's awareness of inequality as well, especially as we look at the possibility of rolling out vaccines?
So it's a great question. We are facing a crisis of inequality in our world right now. We were before the pandemic started, but the pandemic has just put the inequality crisis on steroids. If you think about people who were living in slums when the crisis started, you already had 3.7 billion people living on $5.50 a day or less before the pandemic started. They were one crisis away, one health crisis, one job loss, one sick family member away from falling into extreme poverty, which was less than $1.90 a day. The pandemic hit, and what happened? Countries went into lockdown. If you were living in a slum in Nairobi or Kampala or Mexico City or Karachi, then what you were faced with was the government telling you, no, you are not going to be able to socially distant. We know that because you're living in a slum community. We're not going to be able to get you masks or other forms of PPE. You're not allowed to go out and get a job, and you have no social protection if you've lost your job. So you have a lot of people. The World Bank estimates more than 100 million people who've fallen back into extreme poverty during the pandemic. At the same time as that's happened, you have the richest part of our world economy growing significantly richer. That our economic system is broken if it is leaving people sitting in slums incapable of getting basic health care, while the richest among us are growing fortunes. And what the book argues is that we need to rethink some of our fundamental rules so that through a crisis like this, the kind of thing that Anne is talking about, we can actually grab the moment to make our world healthier, not sicker.
Mm-hmm. All right, great, thank you. Now, as you mentioned, Power Switch is going to be about change that's going to be made by young activists. And I'm sure that it's escaped no one's mind that to be an activist is to have a sense of agency. And if there's one thing that training someone to have an entrepreneurial mindset does, it's to give them that sense of creative agency, that they can do something that makes a difference in their communities and by extension in the world. So how do you see community colleges being able to instill in their students, not just a sense that they can get a job, but a sense that they can become change makers and activists who can make their world a better place?
Well, every time I've asked myself or others this question, what I usually find out is they already are, that there's a remarkable amount of activism already going on community college campuses and elsewhere amongst young people. I have a daughter who's just started in college, and she definitely was my audience when I thought about this. The reason I wrote the book in the way I did was I wanted to talk about power's capacity, that I think in the way that you're talking about, students can create amongst themselves, can grow amongst themselves by organizing and by making some choices. How do they want to organize? Do they want to try and do grassroots work where they're trying to reach large numbers of people through innovative social and entrepreneurial social media work? Or do they want to do grass tops work where they're working with influentials and trying to find who are the change makers that can actually get to policymakers? It's those kinds of questions that the book grapples with. It offers ideas for young activists who are on community college campuses. How do I want to spend my time as efficiently and effectively as possible, not just to grow my own power, which I want to do along with others, but in the end of the day, to redistribute power from those who have too much to folks like us and the people who will benefit. That's what the book is about.
Super. Thank you, Paul. I'm now going to introduce you all to the third author in today's panel, a woman that I'm sure many of you have met already. That's Rebecca Corbin. She is the president of the National Association for Community College Entrepreneurship and one of three authors of Impact Ed. And I'll ask Rebecca to tell you more about her book.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to follow two very distinguished activists and authors. And Tim, congratulations for completing this series in just a record amount of time. I'd also like to thank, as we get started, my co-authors, Professors Andy Gold and Beth Curley. We did this project together, and it was truly a labor of love. So I was thinking about this when we entered into this, the process of writing the book, and really the purpose was thinking about the future and how could we leverage what Paul was just talking about, the spirit in community college campuses and historically Black colleges and universities and other universities around the country to really usher in the opportunity to create change. And part of the book talks about the stories of entrepreneurs, women, immigrants, veterans, non-traditional entrepreneurs that are really having an opportunity to join the middle class and beyond, and really start to equalize opportunity. So the book tells that story and offers shovel-ready and opportunities for everyone to participate in the rebuilding process.
Mm-hmm. And Rebecca, could you tell us more specifically about how the disruption caused by both the pandemic and the economic fallout of that are creating this opportunity for through community colleges for people who have been disadvantaged, women, veterans, people of color?
Yeah, so I'll note that from my perspective, Paul speaks about, countries around the world, and Anne does as well. We look at community colleges as those open access institutions that serve more women, more people of color, people at lower socioeconomic levels. And what we've seen in the United States is that enrollments have largely declined during the pandemic. It was not expected. Usually there is an event like a pandemic and a recession or something like that. And typically enrollments at community colleges will go up. That is not the case. However, one hopeful sign is that enrollments in many entrepreneurial programs are going up. So what that speaks to is really the spirit of people seeing that maybe some traditional jobs and pathways are going away, but if they can embrace the idea that they have the ability to create not only a business, but maybe a skilled trade or a nonprofit organization, and really become part of a bigger network of moving things forward.
Mm-hmm. And part of what you've created in this book for moving things forward is this beautiful acronym, Impact Ed. Would you tell us, please, what the acronym means?
Yes, so that was the idea, I have to say, of Professors Beth and Andy. They love acronyms, and I have to tell you, it really beautifully connects to our first two authors. The I in impact stands for inequality. So, we speak to some of the data that's out there. You've heard about it from a global context, but in the United States and specifically COVID-19 has affected entrepreneurs of color, people of color at disproportionate levels. So we look at inequality in terms of how might we rectify that through programming and things like that. The M stands for mindset, which is entrepreneurial mindset. And the way that we define and embrace that is really a growth mindset and a success mindset. It directly speaks to what Paul was talking about in some of Anne's points about if students and if people in general, women, disadvantaged groups, immigrants, can start to get a sense of a brighter future for themselves and how might they get there, all of a sudden the power switch, if you will, the title of Paul's book, makes really the American dream and the dream of a more peaceful, prosperous global community a reality for people. So it's very much about agency and empowering. The P in our acronym stands for purpose. And my co-authors and I began with a reflection on our own purpose, which was really to change the world for the better. We've all been blessed to have advantages, some challenges as well, that other people, quite frankly, don't have, the people that are living on $5 a day. So collectively, we feel that passion and that purpose to really take the platforms that we have and the tools that we have and to share them with the world. So the A stands for acceleration. And Tim, much as you did with the book series and my co-authors did, you had us work every weekend for months, we accelerated our prescription and our roadmap and our opportunity by highlighting what can be done. The last book that I wrote with 11 different authors, it took us 2 years to finish it. This one we did in an accelerated fashion. Similarly, with the United States election, behind us and us all looking toward 2021, we want to be ready to hit the ground running, and we're ready now. We're reaching out to stakeholders across the country. So that is the acceleration. C stands for community. The community in college stands for this open access. It's one of the things personally and professionally I love about community colleges. Everyone is invited. You could be a high school dropout. You could be a person who doesn't have enough money for tuition. You could be a really savvy college student that knows that you can save a lot of money by doing your first 2 years at community college. Or you can be someone who has a graduate degree or a law degree that is looking for information and knowledge to move ahead. And that's really the spirit of community. Finally, the T is for transformation. I think it's what, Tim, you want to do, and Paul and Anne. You know, we look at the pain and suffering in this world as great opportunity. We would not be able to make the impact that we're going to make had it not been for this just tremendous human suffering. And so I think it just inspires all of us as authors to be the change. And ED, of course, stands for education. I just throw that in.
All right, that is great. Thank you. And of course, the book itself will walk everybody through in much more depth what each of those letters stand for and how they can be infused into a community college education. So where do you see the opportunity to leverage what your network and indeed all the community colleges and higher learning institutions have, not just the buildings, but the people, the communities that surround them, to galvanize them into supporting our recovery? Because we don't have the luxury of sitting around and thinking about this. You know, people's livelihoods will be sliding either downward or upward, but they're not going to be standing still. As you pointed out, that's one of the reasons we accelerated getting this book series out. But now the country needs to get itself on a path of acceleration.
That's right. And Tim, I think you said it beautifully about the existing infrastructure and the scaffolding and everything that is there for community colleges and universities, HBUs, to join forces in every community across the country. We look at that in terms of how do you scale something very, very quickly? And that's what the book speaks to. But I would just say that I think the really big opportunity from my perspective, being a person who's been thinking about entrepreneurship for many years and writing about it and studying it, is that entrepreneurship is a very unifying concept. If you think about it, some people think business creation, but we also think about social entrepreneurship and taking agency and taking stock of your life. That is not a controversial thing. I can speak, you know, as a citizen of the United States, you know, there's a lot of people that are hurt one way or the other. And I think what we need to do to move forward is find what unites us as people, as human beings, a sense of empathy, a sense of purpose, a sense of courage. And from my standpoint, you know, community colleges, entrepreneurship, student success, you know, sharing and caring about other people is really the way that we're going to move forward, so that we don't focus on what differences that we have, but what do we have in common? You know, I'm not naive. I know that there is a power structure, and that people that tend to have the power are reticent to give it up. But I do think that even in the United States, and what I've seen with students across the country voting in record numbers, exercising that right, you know, to me, it's always been more important that people know and have knowledge and exercise rights and have that sense that they do have control over their destiny. That's really what our book is about. And I think that's the connecting point. The other piece I would mention too is really this connection to the world. And I think looking at it as how might we be better partners? How might we really move forward with a sense of trust and rebuilding very big global problems that we've been discussing in the book series, climate change, all kinds of things. Not one country can address this. We need to come together and unify around UN sustainability goals if we really want to make some progress.
Right, and those UN sustainability goals are something that when we become attuned to them, we realize there is actually this huge community of activists, of development specialists, of researchers, of teachers who have thrown themselves into the possibility, not just that we will make our lives better, but that we will make our community and our global community and our planet all a better place to live. And this is in some ways the paradox of your book, that it's about empowering the individual, but one of the keys to empower the individual, as you said, is growing those skills of empathy, growing those skills of looking for opportunity and possibility, not just for you, but for those who are around you, whether they're potential clients or or people that you can mentor. So it's this wonderful balance between a you can do it spirit and we will do it.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about moving from me to we, and you know, I think that's really the way forward. We say all the time, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And you know, to speak even more about leveraging existing assets, NACCE has 8 centers of practice that were formed by community colleges around the country that, in the spirit of creating new resources, sharing, really sort of driving that spirit. One of our staff members who is doing a fabulous job is an immigrant from Ukraine. And so she's been very focused on UN sustainability goals far before she even got to NACCE. And she sat down and she mapped out which of those UN sustainability goals connect to each of our centers of practice. So you're right, everything is already there. We just need to extend the invitation. We need to track it. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that individuals, whether you have a lot of resources, as 2 of our founders of Everyday Entrepreneur Venture Fund, Chip and Stuart Weismiller, did, if you have $1 million that you can put into testing a proof of concept, you can have dramatic impact. Now, not everybody has $1 million, but we've had people come forward to say, I don't have $1 million, but I will mentor a student. I will take my talent and I will serve on a community college advisory board. I will pitch in, I will mentor my neighbor, you know, I will do things. So I think it's not even a matter of if there's a place for everyone. What we're encouraging and inviting people through the book is, if you want a better future, you really need to just assess what's right in front of you and step forward. Certainly you can be part of NACCE and join us. You can become involved and supportive of the HBCU in your state or in your community. There's lots of things that you can do. And that's what I love about this series. There's so many opportunities. So I would say to a lot of the NACCE family that's tuned in, if you're a faculty member and you're teaching a class, maybe you're teaching a class on graphic design, one of the things that you can do is you can use the concepts not only in our book, but really in all the books, to try to open up our students' minds to the fact that they can do what Paul talked about and Anne talked about. One of the things I love about these books is they're really inexpensive. I feel like I'm an infomercial, but I was pleasantly surprised. And I will tell you that everyone who's tuning in on the webinar today is getting a copy of the Impact Ed book. But, you know, if you really are serious about doing this work, I mean, I make that commitment to you. Reach out to me personally. We'll figure out a way to get you some of these books. So that's how excited that I am about NACCE and about the Reset series and just about being here today. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you, Rebecca. And let's broaden out from what you've just talked about, which is reaching out to the world. You've got the Sustainable Development Goals, but you've also spoken in your book about going from 50 states, expanding the work of entrepreneurial mindset education through the US, but then to 50 nations, 50 states and 50 nations. And here you've got the international activist community, Oxfam and all the others in that world. And here you've got Anne's World Bank Development Community and all of those. In a sense, you've got the people with the passion and the people with the money, although it's clearly a mixed bag. So where do you see community colleges and other higher learning institutes as reaching out, not just institutions like this, but to communities like this, who each in their own way are already doing this work of helping us recover and find this better, more equal future?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I've thought about that a lot. And I would love to hear from Anne and Paul as well, because one of the things that my co-authors and I have been kicking around is, once we begin this scaling process, NACCE is already in more than 45 states, but as we start to really ramp up what we're doing with Impact Ed, what we want to do is provide some guidance to the centers of practice and the colleges that jump on board to how might they best select a nation to focus on. If they decide that they want to get involved with global entrepreneurship and they want to learn about another country, another culture. And, you know, I'd love to hear both from Paul and from Anne, if you were advising some of the community college faculty that are tuning in, that are getting excited about this, how would you recommend that they sort of walk their classes or their students through how to focus their efforts, because you can't focus on the whole world. Where do you begin? So maybe, Anne, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear you comment on that. And then Paul, maybe you could share some thoughts as well, if that's okay with you, Tim.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. So I wanted to start by adding something that I probably did not mention in my earlier intervention about the role of institutions in African countries during this period. They've really come into the three aspects that have been important in responding to COVID-19. The first one was as a set of organizations and schools that could disseminate information about the positive aspects of what governments were trying to push out, whether it was wearing masks or washing hands. The second one, especially for higher education, has been research. African institutions have been involved in the kind of research, for example, of creating simple tests for the pandemic. I can give an example of two countries in West Africa, but it's widespread in terms of institutions getting really involved in research to respond to the pandemic. The final one that I wanted to be able to share is that because a lot of these institutions had to close, they have also been transformed into treatment centers for the victims of the pandemic. And I just wanted to be able to share that, Rebecca. Now, in direct response to your question, it's basically going to be a case by case, institution by institution, I say professor by professor, because there are many ways that the pandemic response has really brought the world much closer, and which goes into the idea of expanding on collaboration. So my suggestion would be for any institution at the level of junior colleges to decide on three aspects, basically. The region, it's going to have to be on a regional preference or regional issue. The second one, I believe, is going to be on the area of interest of each institution. And then the third one is going to be the conduit, because they're different conduits to having institutions get together. And so it really depends on which access do you have. Are you going through the overall national organizations? Are you going through, may I even suggest, embassies? So it depends on the region that your educational systems are interested in. It depends on the areas of specific focus and interest, and also the ease of having these connections made.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Paul, did you want to add on to that?
Sure. And I'll give you a different take, although I agree with everything that Anne said, but my experience. So the main thing about my experience is that my early experience is now entirely irrelevant. So when I first started out and you'd asked that question, I was like, well, you got to find out who's organizing the core activism. It's probably happening in Washington or in London, and then you find out who they are, and then you find out what their plan is, and then you go out as a sort of foot soldier or emissary to whichever country it is that you want to work in, and you'd sort of keep the amplification going. That's not the way it works anymore. Think about how Black Lives Matter is moving now. There is nobody sitting in South Africa or Uganda or Australia or anywhere else waiting for Command Central, Black Lives Matter, to tell them, what do I do today? We are living in a world of activist entrepreneurship where messages are moving faster than we could have imagined, where ideas are being shared and adapted into context, and where young activists are making movements their own. So where I think a lot of really exciting activism is I think folks have to decide for themselves where their energies are and be willing to explore it, partly by being open in that context to what's going on without expecting it to be in that old sort of command and control form of activism. And it's super exciting as a time. It's a little scary if you come from organized activism background like I did. One last story. We were sorting out climate campaigns because I think, racial justice and climate campaigning is where so much activist energy is right now. So we were organizing activist campaigns last year, and we put ourselves on an 8-month timeline to try and get 100,000 people going. In order to get some advice, we asked some young activists from schools, not just colleges, but high schools, to join us to give us advice. We got 3 of them in a room from Mexico, from I think it was from Kenya, and it was from somewhere in Asia. We got them in a room. We said, so how many folks have you got organized? And basically, collectively, they had about 200,000 people ready to walk out of schools in each of those contexts. We was like, ooh, that's impressive. That must have taken years. And we were like, so how long did that take you? And they said, because that's a lot of work. And they said, one of them turned around and said, oh no, you don't understand. We've been working on this for 4 weeks. And we were like, oh my God, activism is moving so fast now in college campuses, in high schools, and it's because they're not waiting for the old rules. So a lot of what young activists are teaching older activists now is how to be entrepreneurial. So, I mean, part of it is work with each other, be creative, don't wait for the old guard to tell you the rules, certainly don't wait for Command Central. But I do think, and that's what my book tries to reflect on, there are lessons around what not to do and what to do that can speed up your efforts. It's super exciting what's going on in the world. And it is really a global phenomenon now.
Yeah, I love what you said. And I think to me, it feels exhilarating because it feels like we're not stuck with the same labels and structure, and people that feel more comfortable in a creative environment, which truly should be all of us, if we all are really practicing these kind of things. But I'm very encouraged. We saw that in the United States on some of just the horrendous issues that even happened before the pandemic. You saw young people really mobilizing and having an impact. And I think knowing that you don't have to get an engraved invitation, you invite yourself. Literally, you can become the president and CEO of whatever you want to create. You can create a website, you can print a business card, you can go out and get customers. And I think that is truly the message that we need to share. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited about education, because, from my perspective as an educator and someone who has spent lots and lots of time in school earning degrees, I do think that is the leveling when people, they don't even have to get, a formal degree, but embracing lifelong learning and some of the strategies that you speak about are really exciting. And I think prior, Tim, because I want to turn it back to you, but I think, before being acquainted with this whole project, I never thought of myself as an activist, but now I do. I feel like it's my responsibility as a leader and as a mother and as a community member to really make sure that I'm informed about what I know and look into what I don't know. And I think what I like about this series is they're easy to read. I mean, I can speak for our book. We tried to sort of model a chicken soup for the soul kind of mixture on steroids, if you will, because it's about change. But it's really that ability to convey stories, and I think more importantly to convey hope. And I think that's what you do, Paul, that's what you do, Anne, and that's what all the others that you haven't even heard from today. So in terms of the NACCE family and the NACCE community, we're going to be launching a book tour throughout the whole year. So we look forward to introducing you to more of the authors, because if we sort of knit together what our philosophy is, we're at a critical juncture. So anyway, thanks for giving me some of your time, Tim.
Oh, hey, and this is one of the One of the things that we've all learned in this strange world in which we have had to adapt and change quickly is now you can actually have a high-powered group of pragmatic visionaries come together pretty much anywhere in the country, pretty much anywhere in the world with just a little bit of time. Voila, we're all here instantly. You know, this to me ties back to the 50 nations. The internet has been such an amazing game changer. That's what's allowed these student activists to so quickly mobilize the many people that Paul was talking about. Now, for leaders, and I'm thinking here to those who are enjoying this conversation, there's a real challenge here. There's a tendency to think of educational leaders as thinking of themselves as the apex of the pyramid, and they are going to teach what they know, or other teachers will teach what they know, and then that will percolate down, and the apprentices will gradually learn to be like them. That's not going to happen now, right?
Right.
We're going to take whatever knowledge we've got to give the next generation, who will do stuff with it that's very different than we can even really conceive of. So the whole role of leadership in education, I think, is on the cusp of something that must be very exciting, and yet I can imagine for those who have joined this conversation, a little unsettling, because we really don't know what the future will hold. But you know,
I was going to say too, Tim, it just reminds me of it really is a lot of what we talk about in higher ed of a flipped classroom, and a lot of the training that we do. In fact, crazy story, my colleague Jeff Smith and I were out at a tire shop yesterday. We wanted to experiment and see, does design thinking work as well in a company as it does the work we do with middle school kids and college faculty and college presidents. And it was amazing, because I think a lot of what we're learning is really to trust the wisdom of the group. So I've seen middle school kids, I worked with a group of them one day where they were trying to solve gun violence. These are young men of color that are in one of the most dangerous cities in the United States. And they were using design thinking principles to talk about how could they make their communities safer. And they came up with stuff I would venture to say that, you know, rivaled or probably exceeded what a group of policymakers could come up with. Why? Because the students are living that existence. So I think personally, and I'd love to hear what Anne and Paul think about this, but the more educated I get, the more I realize I don't know. And I think what we can all do as individuals and people is learn how to ask really good questions and really challenge assumptions, because some things that we have just thought were true, and when you really dig into it, things are not always as they appear. And I think we need to model that for our students and for people that we interact with, is that we might have, maybe we have the biggest paycheck or the most degrees, but a lot of times we are not the smartest people in the room. Our job is really to lead others to a sense of purpose and clarity. And I think if we can do that, as everyone on this call does, that's fulfilling a mission. That's a big responsibility. So I'd love to hear, if you don't mind, Anne, what you and Paul, sort of your take on leadership is in this new paradigm that we are kind of living through.
So thank you, Rebecca. I just want to agree with you by saying that clearly learning and education and leadership does not necessarily have to be through a formal process. And I want to give you an example of this week, actually. I was reading about the campaign processes that are going on in different countries, and this particular one is a campaign in Uganda, where there is a group that has come together, and their title is the Association of the Uneducated. And the Association of the Uneducated has requested for parliamentary seats to represent them. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that, one, they are clearly not uneducated. They have an education to a certain level. They understand their voice, and they understand their interests, and they're willing to come forward and put requests into a political system, not on the basis of how much formal education they've gone through, but on the basis of their interests. So there are many ways of leadership, and I thought that one was a perfect example of what you're talking about.
What do you think, Paul? You look pensive.
No, I'm enjoying this. I'll tell you honestly what I was just thinking. I was thinking if you had said to me, because that there are going to be 70 million folks in this country who vote for the incumbent politician, what do you think is the likelihood of there being a change in our presidential leadership? And I would have said, wow, even in the last election, which won more than anyone in history up to that point, the person who won the popular vote got 63 million votes. So if you're telling me that the incumbent got 70 million, I would have had to dig deep into the question you just asked to believe that people want to lead their own futures. And because what this election essentially said is as many people who voted for the status quo, there was 5-6 million more now. That meant 6 million more people, 76 million people wanted to show a different kind and to ask for a different kind of leadership. And if you ask me how it happened, it was because leaders of all sorts in many communities came together across racial justice activism, across economic activism with workers and union organizers, across gender justice activism, across. And not to say that the other side was all wrong and this side was all right, but there was a lot of leaderful people in the United States that decided this was the time to step up as activists. And I think now the real question is the country willing to keep going on an ambitious journey of transformation and justice and peace and respect? And I think a lot of that's going to be about how we reach across the aisles to each other, how we engage each other, how we expect leaderful engagement from every American. And that, for me, is a really exciting moment to witness. So I'm really hopeful. I am optimistic. One of the premises of my book is pessimists are usually right and optimists are often wrong, but all the great things are done by optimists. And I just feel like now is a time for that.
I agree. I was going to say, too, one of the things that really, kind of inspired me is that you feel the sense of opportunity for reconciliation. And it sounds like an odd thing in some respects, because, certainly in what you're talking about in election, somebody has to lose, somebody, obviously prevails. And it affects different communities differently. But, we spend a lot of time at NACCE, principally because one of our staff members focuses on this a lot, but on, transformation. And if you look, historically at Rwanda and some of the things, I mean, human beings have a great capacity for growth and also for forgiveness. And I think it's how do we turn the page and offer more opportunity? But, for those people who are willing to be open to new thought processes, like you just laid out of if somebody would have told you that, you would have thought, oh, well, it's going to be a different outcome. I think cultivating that and practicing that and really thinking and challenging assumptions of what you normally think about is, I think, that really the power of reading, it's the power of sharing, it's the power of doing what we're doing today. And I think, activists sort of at certain points sort of had that connotation of a rabble rouser, if you will. But I think there is an opportunity to be an activist, but be a very concerned global citizen and really to reach inside yourself and start to look at what do we have in common? How do we move forward? How do we make the world better for other people?
So everybody, thank you so much for your thoughts and insights. I'd like to turn it back over to each of our authors now for their final thoughts and wishes for you, our listeners and audience. Let's have Anne, please go first.
Thank you, Tim. I'd like to conclude this conversation on my own part by saying that as much as the pandemic, COVID-19, has been a challenge globally, it provides us an opportunity as a global community to reflect on where we would want to be in the next pandemic. And I believe that there are 4 aspects that are going to be important as we move into the future. The first one is going to be how better to collaborate as nations. The second one is going to be how we can share information and coordinate the information that we have in case of pandemics. The third one is going to, of course, be to try and indeed deepen the cooperation that we have among people, among nations, among communities. And then the final one, I believe, is going to be how we are going through the experience of this pandemic to communicate better and to be able to share experiences, information, and create a better global community. That's what I'd like to leave with your audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And Paul, let's hear from you.
Well, I agree with Anne. I will say that I think the lesson of history is that power switches only happen after a moment of acute crisis. And we are facing the pandemic that Anne has talked about, an economic inequality crisis that we haven't seen in generations, a racial justice crisis, and a climate crisis. All of them converging. And from that moment, we could find an immense opportunity, but it is going to depend on effective activism, challenging leaders to do what's right. So it's going to depend on a lot of you and the conversations you choose to have. And I would love to be a fellow traveler on any part of that.
Thank you, Paul. And Rebecca, you please.
Yeah, that's so well said. And I think about, Paul, what you said, your last point about really having moral courage and having conversations that might be difficult. I think here in the United States with the murder of George Floyd and some of the things that followed, I think a lot of us realized that we weren't having the conversations that we need to have. We were maybe making assumptions. And I think we all bear that responsibility. But as Anne has spoken about, and Paul and Tim, I'm incredibly hopeful, mostly because I get to work with NACCE and people that just raise their hand and they just do stuff and they do it for the good of the students that we serve and the communities that we live in. So I would just like to thank you, Tim, and all of the authors just for the opportunity to collaborate. I think I've probably learned more about myself and my community and my resiliency through this experience. And let's not let a good, thing go to waste. It's going to be a long haul, but I think we really need to join forces and really make the world a better place. So NACCE members, thank you so much for tuning into the webinar today. As you can see on the screen, we have the contact information for the authors. We have a number of resources for you. So we hope that you'll stay in touch. This is the first of other webinars and exciting events to follow. So be sure to join us on NACCE Meets, and please reach out to us anytime if you have any questions or if you want to get involved in any way. So thank you for your time today.